Hello, everyone. We're going to wait 2 minutes or maybe 3 minutes, and we'll then kick off our webinar. We're just waiting for some people to join. I think we've got a few more people joining. Let's give it another kind of 2 minutes or so, if you guys all don't mind waiting, and then we'll take you through kind of what we've prepped for today. There's a chat box. You can ask questions as we kind of go through the webinar, but at the end we'll have a Q&A session where we can go into more depth and hopefully get some more questions from all of you. We'll give it a minute more and then we'll start. Hope everyone's having a good Tuesday. Cool. We'll go ahead and start now. Chuchup, I think or Nudge, you guys are sending messages and I'm hearing all your audio, so maybe you'll turn that off as we go through this. Right. Hi, everyone. I'm Farouk, and I'm the CEO and founder of Zeroe. Today, I have with me Cecep Hermawan, and Cecep is a product manager at Zeroe. He's based in Indonesia. And Najd Al-Raisi, and she's part of one of our climate solutions consultants, and she helps deliver Zeroe as we work with customers. And she's based in Dubai, but she's currently in Muscat, which is her home. I'm in Dubai, just for the reference. I guess, what we're going to do today is whether you're kind of part of a sustainability team or kind of supporting it, our goal today is to help you understand your different reporting obligations in terms of emissions measurement. Our goal isn't to make this a software demo or a sales pitch. Our goal is to kind of provide practical information about what it actually takes to produce audit-ready emissions data, especially if you're in an organization that's under-resourced or under pressure or nowhere near ready. I think over the next kind of 45 minutes, we're going to kind of walk you through why this work has changed. So why the old way of building reports no longer holds up and what that old way was. What's really kind of blocking, or what we see blocking, sustainability teams on the inside. We've kind of worked and talked with over, let's say, 190 sustainability teams over the last kind of 12 to 18 months. And we kind of see that it's not a motivation problem. There's a lot of other challenges, and we want to talk about those today. what audit ready in our words actually means, and how you can build towards it, even if you're kind of just getting started as an organization. And finally, kind of what the journey looks like when it works. The playbook we've used to help teams across the world, in Indonesia, in the GCC, and in Europe, kind of go from kind of chaos to confidence in like 10 to 12 weeks, in a very quick process of actually helping them kind of go from being nowhere to somewhere. In terms of kind of why the work has changed, right? And I'll kind of touch on a couple of points. I think a lot of the people in this room are kind of either from the GCC, or Southeast Asia. So I think that we'll touch on that from different markets. But first off, I think we look at it and say sustainability reporting is now compliance. It's not just communication. I think if we look at many organizations in their first couple years of sustainability reporting, they're producing a report to tell the stories of what's happening within their organization, right? It sits under comms or marketing. The information is collected once a year, generally kind of in the last 3 months of a financial year, and an organization assembles a bunch of information, paints a story, and then produces a report. And that report, comes out with its financial report, and it's really just about communicating. Hey, this is where we are. This is what we're doing, and it's very much a story. What's changing is that story is now about compliance. Those statements are being evaluated. They're being evaluated by regulators. They're being evaluated by shareholders and other stakeholders, and that changes the game in our view. We see in the UAE, as of May of this year, companies now have to report on their emissions, and those disclosures will need to be auditable, especially if they fall under certain categories. As you work with banks, those disclosures are also being auditable if you're accessing sustainable finance. And if you're in the EU, then CSRD requires those emissions disclosures to be auditable and verifiable. And that changes the game in terms of how you need to actually approach this. If we kind of take what is the kind of internal ask, which is what what this session is really about. Because if a board asks you, is your data defensible? They're asking a sustainability team, hey, you're disclosing us this, you're providing us this emissions data. Can you back that data up? And the challenge that we see kind of, a lot of sustainability teams having is being able to answer that question with confidence. So what do we see as kind of the internal reality, for sustainability teams, right? Sustainability teams get asked to produce auditable emissions data. And what's the challenge? Well, emissions data doesn't sit with the sustainability team. The sustainability team is actually meant to be the glue that pulls all of this information together. But that emissions data really sits with 10 departments, right? Facilities management, or finance might have utility bills. In some organizations, both departments that we've seen has that information, right? Procurement knows, what they're buying, but they classify items in the way that they classify it, right? An administrative department may have petty cash transactions that were used for fueling vehicles within a fleet. And IT has arguably the connection into all the systems, but then some of the information might not actually be in a system, right? A thing that we commonly see is electricity bills and kilowatt hours, right? Which is your part of your scope 2 and your purchased energy. That information is sitting with no one because it's in a bill, and then finance posts the dollar value or the dirham value or the rupiah value into their financial systems, and that information gets lost. So information sits across kind of 10 different departments. A challenge is that sustainability teams really have no access by default because they're generally created to drive sustainability across the organization, but they don't have tentacles into every department, and they need to work with other departments to get that information. So the product of a productive sustainability team is purely based upon that team's ability to engage with the wider organization, right? And then if they are kind of getting information, and sustainability teams are working with the rest of the organization to collect information, what the challenge is what generally gets produced isn't traceable, verifiable, and repeatable. And what we mean by traceable is if you go back into your emissions report or emissions data that you've collected, are you able to actually say where this data came from? And not, it came from Chechep at Zeroe.io on an email on August 10th of last year. But no, where did Chechep get that information from? What system did it come from? Do we know the source of that data? Do we know the parameters in which we got that data? Is that all the data that we were supposed to get? And then, is it verifiable? And then is it repeatable? So can I consistently get that information monthly, or do I get it once a year? And do I exchange 20 or 30 emails to make it happen? So that's kind of what we see as kind of the internal reality. Now, as we kind of go through the rest of this webinar, my goal will be to kind of, I'm going to have a chat with Chechep and Nudge, because they are very much the people that are in the front lines talking with organizations that we work with about what are those challenges. And we're going to kind of run this as a bit of a Q&A and kind of guide you through kind of what we actually, see happening, right? If we go to the next slide, I guess, my first question, right, is, and I'll start with Nudge. Nudge, like when we look at kind of, when the data isn't there or can't be traced, what happens within these organizations?
All right, I hope you guys can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Perfect. So like you said, data is the foundation of all the work that we do when it comes to sustainability strategy and reporting, right? So if the data is not there or it cannot be traced or verified, it quite literally derails everything else. So sustainability teams find themselves kind of stuck in an endless loop of chasing different departments and chasing data that lives in different formats, like kind of mismanaged Excel spreadsheets or reports that they then have to sit and reconcile and try to make sense of. And that pressure builds up to like produce something that may pass an audit. And the problem is that this is an endless cycle. Like every reporting cycle, they have to go through the same thing, and they have to collect information that sits in someone's inbox or sits in someone's WhatsApp, and it's just scattered all over the place, or it lives in systems that are siloed that sustainability teams do not have access to. And so this repeated cycle is exhausting, and unfortunately, it has to be repeated almost every year or every reporting cycle or whenever management requires that information. So it becomes quite a burden.
And I think like if we look at this, right, there's like a stat here on the screen, right, which is like 46% of the FTSE 100 companies revised or restated their climate data in 2024. I think the devil in that detail is it was scope 1 and 2 data. So that's the most, let's go and say every company that's measuring emissions is going to start with scope 1 and 2. And 46% of them are publicly disclosing this information, and then they're having to actually revise that data or restate their numbers in subsequent years. And I think, Chechep, would you like, if we look at companies that we've worked with that were manually measuring emissions before, and then we kind of move them to a digital system and look at an auditable trail, I think we're finding that where many of these organizations are actually having to revise and restate, first off, their boundaries, and then, not just their organizational boundaries of what, they should be measuring and what they shouldn't be measuring, but then they're also having to then go and restate the data sources and kind of, get into the details that they had missed when they were doing it manually as they start kind of going through this. Would you agree?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, like, it's all about like when the company doesn't know that they have this kind of data, they don't really know that they have this kind of emissions. So I think most of the time it's about like not knowing what is considered as material to your kind of like emissions inventory. So when we go into like the new organization, the new client, we usually start with like mapping out everything first. We try to see comprehensively what's their possible emission sources and see whether they're already reporting it like in a previous year or not. If it's not being reported in the previous year, so we help them to actually build up that kind of like data readiness within the organization, so it's become like easily audit ready afterwards.
And I think one of the challenges is if sustainability doesn't get it right on that first report, and that report is really what goes to senior management and says, hey, this is what our emissions are. And then next year they're like, oh yeah, we kind of left 20% off our balance sheet. That's like a big, well, that loses trust in the function, right? And it loses trust in the actual initiative of what we're supposed to, what that organization is actually, that function is aiming to achieve in supporting that organization. I keep on thinking about this like metaphor of like, no one does their financial data using an abacus, right? Like no one's using an abacus to do their financial accounting, but a lot of organizations are starting their journey in terms of like sustainability and measuring emissions by using an abacus. Yeah. And you're like, well, if you have tools out there to do this better, and reality is all the actual pieces that you need to be counting are across an organization. How do you actually set up an organization to do that, right? But if we kind of move on, if we look at kind of like what does audit ready actually mean, and I'll touch on that. We'll touch with both of you on this. So like Ned's to like, when we say audit ready, what do teams think it means, and what does it actually mean?
Sure. I think the first instinct when we hear that anything is audit ready is that it looks presentable, it looks good, that it's a nice looking report or a nice looking spreadsheet. But in actuality, what happens in audits is that in order for it to pass that check, it needs to be verified, it needs to be traceable, and you need to be able to go down to the source of information. So the key thing here is that every data point that you have in your report should have a known source, and then you should be able to track exactly what happened to it after it left that source. So who submitted that information, who verified it, who reviewed it. You should be able to trace every single change that was made to it. So when we say audit ready, it should be about the information or your report standing the test and standing scrutiny, not just it looking good.
And then Chechep, like if we look at it from a systems point of view, what makes emissions data trustworthy?
I think trustworthy mean that the system need to be able to deliver data that is like verifiable, reusable, and traceable. And say that in a normal manual process is always something like we kind of try to find all of the data, and then like we do the reporting, and then the system just kind of like get a reset, and then like the next quarter we will be able to do the same thing again and again to do the same like process manually that takes a lot of times. I think in the past, maybe in the 2015 to 2020, especially in Southeast Asia, sustainability reporting always comes 2 years late of the financial reporting. And the reason because of like this kind of like system is not really trustworthy to provide the sustainability data. It's really different from now that you can actually like trace everything out. The process is always repeatable. That company can go into like their trusted system and take the data that they have and know like who is actually the original owner of the data, be able to verify like the digital sources all of this data, and then be able to know like what kind of manipulation that happened within the system to provide them with the final emissions output. And I think without the system, this is something that will be really hard to achieve. Right now we have the sustainability report comes in the same time as annual report. In Indonesia, we call it like integrated annual report. Unlike like all of the previous year where sustainability report comes like 2 years late because there's like problems within the system and such.
Yeah, I mean, when you say like a sustainability report being produced 2 years after the end of the year, I mean, that's exactly, I mean, we go back to like the early slide, right? Like that's communication. The only reason that that organization produced that sustainability report was to communicate. I still see, I would say the vast majority, I would say more than 50% of the organizations and the markets that we're present in not able to produce a sustainability report with their financial reporting. They're like 2 or 3 months delayed. They definitely couldn't do it on a monthly, right? So when they close their financial books on a monthly basis, could they produce an emissions calculation for that month? Definitely not happening yet. A couple of organizations are getting there. If they've fully implemented a system, they've automated data flows and so on, but they're definitely not doing it monthly. I think the majority of them are not being able to get it done within 3 or 4 months of their end of the year financials still. It's like I still see sustainability reports where in like July, I see, published on LinkedIn, hey, look at our new sustainability report. And I'm like, that's awesome. That's for communication. But, and not just laughing here, but you know what I'm talking about. But that's not for compliance, right? That report or those emissions calculations weren't done for compliance. They were done to produce kind of a nice shiny PDF. But, fundamentally with regulations, that's no longer kind of a viable process. I think we're going to see a big shift. But I think to get to kind of audit ready, we see a lot of organizations spending the last 3 months of the year kind of chasing data, right? Or sustainability teams spending 80% of their year chasing data from other departments. So if we kind of transition for a moment and we kind of say like, how do we actually deliver audit ready emissions? Maybe I'll go to you, Checha, right? Because you probably executed the process first with me as we kind of worked with our first organizations over the last couple of years, right? How do we actually get teams from kind of zero to having nothing to being audit ready, and kind of what are those key phases?
Okay, so yeah, I guess it's like 4 big steps here, but let's start with the first one. So we generally start with a kickoff. The kickoff here is that we try to go into the organizations that we are deployed in, for example, like company A or whatever it is, and then we start to trying to understand their entire business operations. We try to understand their kind of like their huge organization, the relationship between the holding and like with each of the entities, or like how each of their physical location is being operated on. So the purpose is that we don't want to miss any single points within the organization behind, because one of the problems with kind of like audit ready emissions inventory is about, oh, we forget something is happening in that operational location, in the remote location or something like that. There's like a big problem that we see in my career as well. And then like in this process, we try to understand the entire business process, so nothing's left behind. And then the second one is that we try to kind of like configure what are the emissions that are material for this company. Maybe let's say it's scope 1 and scope 2. Everyone will always have scope 1 and scope 2, but which scope 1 is like applicable for that company? Are they having stationary combustions or not? Are they having mobile combustion? Are they really managing their fugitive emissions, the refrigerants within the organization? Oh, it turns out they're like a coal mining operation, so they have kind of like methane fugitive emissions from their coal operation, which they did not consider before, because the only thing fugitive emission is just about the cooling that you're using within your building or stuff like that. So we go to the company, we try to understand how their business operates, we try to understand what kind of operational location are material for their emissions inventory, and what are the emissions categories that is material for them. That's kind of like the first step of how we configure the organizational structures. Second one, we try within this first step of the process, we try to see who is actually like owning the data for each of the emission category. We try to align the roles for every single part of the organization. We see who is actually owning stationary combustion data. Let's say it may be the internal controller, because it relates to all of the diesel that used for generator or something like that. And when it comes to mobile combustion, maybe the data owner is the fleet managers. So we try to align all of these roles. We try to manage the stakeholders here to get the most accurate data from every single part of the organizations. Because the owner of the data is not the sustainability team. Sustainability team is just like the one who are managing your emissions output at the end. But the one who owns the most accurate data is the each part of the organization itself. And then I guess the second step is the data discovery process. We try to collect the data, all of the data from the organization, review the sample file. We kind of like understand how the company data is being managed within the organization. That's really important as well. And then the third part, we set up kind of like Zeroe. We set up our system to work with the company kind of like business process. We try to educate people. We educate the people who own the data. We try to talk to them and like to train them to how to input like the most accurate data from their business operations. Because most of the time, it's not that they don't understand what data that is needed for emission inventory. It's just about like translating what they know from their day-to-day operations into what we actually need for the emission inventory. And it's usually not really a hard process because like, oh, mobile combustion is all about a fuel that the company fleet is expanding. And then like, oh, okay, I have all of these data, so I understand what I should be uploading. So such thing is like something that we train the contributors within the organization. We create the logic. What is the validation logic for the data? What is the validation logic for the company business process? And finally, after we have everything, we can build the dashboard that really matter for the company, that really matter for maybe the directors within the company. And we provide like all the necessary export for like their business process, for their sustainability reporting, for their audit process, for whatever the purpose for the emissions inventory that they have within the organization. I guess that's kind of the process for it.
Cool. So like if I kind of sum up, right, like the steps that we're taking, as you can see, Chacha was very passionate about this because finding the data is like the fun part, right? So like if we kind of look, what are we doing when we're working with an organization? We're kicking it off. We're essentially mapping that organization, the people that have that information, right? We're collecting that data and we're understanding, is this data the right data? Do we have the right information? And then instead of actually as helping that sustainability team collect it all and collate it themselves, we're actually kind of engaging with that organization to have their people upload that data in its first iteration, right? So the first time you're kind of working on your audit ready report, it's not that a consultant comes in, collects all the data and makes the report for you, because you can do that, but what ends up happening is you can't do it again then because the people didn't actually they weren't part of that process, right? So what we're actually doing is we're getting the people to understand the information they need to give, have them provide that system, and then create that kind of auditable report. If we, I had another question for you nudged here, but I'm actually going to kind of skip that one, right? And I think we can kind of go kind of like into action, right? So like what happens over kind of a journey in a little bit of detail so that, can you walk us through kind of, if a team starts from scratch, what happens and how do they use a system to get to auditable emissions?
All right, so assuming that company or organization has never done anything or any sustainability reporting themselves, other than having like an outsider or a consultant come do it for them, you typically don't really know where the data lives or what is contributing to that, to your overall emissions profile. So we start with them, like I said before, by like a mapping exercise where you map both the organization and where the data lives within that organization. After that's done, and typically this is where the bulk of the work takes place, is that you attribute all the various emission sources to a task-based system. So like you said, we go to the data from its source, and every emission source has a task associated with it. Once those tasks go live, and once the people who are supposed to be submitting those tasks are trained on how to do it, then this becomes much more seamless, where every month or every reporting period, however you set it, the task goes out, we collect the data, you have another layer of someone else who is responsible to review and verify that information, to give you the go ahead if it looks good. If not, you send it back and you have that kind of revised. Once that's done and you're sure of the validity of the data in the system, then all of your data in your inventory gets collated and submitted in a dashboard. Dashboards go live, and you can rest assured that every single data point, every single emission source can be traced back to its origin, basically. And then this becomes kind of a seamless cycle where, as long as you have the tasks assigned to the right people, there's no need to go through the mapping exercise again. You don't need to go through mapping the emission points again. This becomes a cycle, and the system takes the burden off the shoulder of the sustainability team. It also makes it easier for those other departments where, let's not forget, this is not their obligation. Like if I'm talking about finance team, it's not their obligation to worry about sustainability data. So oftentimes it's also a burden for them to kind of work with this and provide the data required from their end. So this makes it easier for everybody across the organization to have this repeated in a cycle that doesn't require you to rebuild every reporting period. I hope
Yeah, no, I think that's clear. I mean, like, for me, the most important thing on this slide is like no rebuild required next quarter or next year, right? By approaching this, by accepting that the sustainability team isn't the one in control of everything. The sustainability team isn't the single department that owns the data, and that the collective organization is required to produce the output that the sustainability team has been made accountable for. That's like the first step, right? And I think the only companies that acknowledge that get to realizing that they need a system. Because then the only other way of getting all that information is having tons of bodies running around liaising with lots of departments. Yeah. So if you kind of accept that, look, the sustainability department doesn't have all of this information, that information sits across a wider organization, and you say, okay, we need a system to deal with this. And then once you look at this from a system standpoint, you're then saying, well, how do we create a way for the sustainability team to sit on top of everything and make sure that all the pieces come into place to have it happen? And how do we create a system that allows the people across the organization to not be burdened by all of this, right? Because when it is a burden, then no one wants to do it, and then the value of the organization is diminished. Value of the entire exercise is diminished, shall I say. Okay. Well, kind of like I'll transition to kind of like, okay, so what happens next, right? So for us, like if we kind of look at this, right, like, you've kind of got like step one, focus on kind of audit ready emissions delivery. My strong view is the day an organization decides that they're going to measure emissions, they should be approaching it from an audit ready perspective. Because if it's not audit ready from day one, then there was no point in doing it. And I think if we kind of went back to that earlier slide where like a lot of organizations are restating their emissions, the reason they're doing that is because they didn't approach it from an audit ready standpoint. They approached it from a communication standpoint, right? They approached it from, let's say that we're measuring our emissions. The point isn't to say that you're measuring your emissions. The point is to actually measure your emissions and to be able to know that they are auditable and that they do mean something, right? So that's step one for an organization. What happens afterwards? I think what happens after that, if an organization is embarking on this journey and saying, hey, we're going to be audit ready, the next thing is, well, how do we actually make the organization own the work we're doing, right? How do we create internal system ownership where, the people within the organization are using the tool to output auditable results? And once you've got that done, I think there's a lot of steps that happen. So a lot of organizations are like, okay, well, we're doing this to produce the report. I think what happens is if you do step one and you do step two and you implement a system, you're going to have a lot of people across an organization doing work to get the data to the sustainability team. It's much smoother. It's much more digitized. At least there's a process flow that governs how information is being collected. But many people across the organization are doing work, right? And if we look at kind of, for the sake of efficiency, and asNej mentioned, it's not their job necessarily to just collect data for the sustainability team. There we then kind of look at kind of how do we automate certain processes? How do we connect into that data, right? Oh, well, we realize that kind of, all of our fuel data is sitting in chip cards that we have with a fuel provider in our country, and all transactions are there. And then the vehicles across our organization are sitting in our asset registry. And we know which vehicles are being used by which departments and which business function. And we know how much fuel each vehicle is consuming. So we can now connect into those two data sources. We can merge those two sets of data. We can transform that data, and we can have it input into the system. And now the person that was collecting that data and uploading it doesn't have to do it. And now the sustainability team doesn't have to chase that data on a monthly basis. It's automated, and the flow of that information flows, seamlessly into a report. And on another note, if we kind of touch decarbonization, a lot of organizations, we're going to commit to net zero in 2050, or we have short-term and midterm targets of 2040 and 2045. The only way that you can actually execute on those targets is data, right? And having clarity around that data. And I think that's what comes after you start accepting that this needs to be a system-based approach. I think
Farouk, I'd like to add one more thing on your note about kind of automating some of this data that's received from other departments other than sustainability. Another benefit here is that oftentimes there are a lot of mistakes that are done, with emission factors and calculations. But if you have a system that automates the collection of data from its live source, it can actually serve as a benefit for those other departments, because you catch if there are mistakes, or so for example, if you have a meter that's running and it's kind of reporting electricity use that goes up in a month, and the sustainability team catches it because the emissions are going up in that month, you can also then go back to that department and flag that issue. And that serves like as another benefit beyond just sustainability, but for these other teams, because you're automating that work.
Cool. Okay. I think we have, what we're going to do is I'm going to go through kind of like what, are you audit ready? And we're going to share to everyone, that registered for this call or attended today. We're going to share a little bit of an audit ready emissions brief in the coming day or two, in terms of like a checklist of determining kind of, are you audit ready? But this is kind of like, these are the kind of questions that we go through, right? So like, do you have a clear list of legal entities or business units where you operate? Are you aware of, which sites or facilities use fuel, electricity, or refrigerants? Have you attempted one or two before? Can you access monthly electricity bills, fuel logs, so on? Do you know how your energy is billed? Have you collected this type of data from multiple departments? Do you have someone that can, upload Excel files or scan PDFs? Can you assign people to actually contribute to this or approve information as it flows through? And do you want to own the system internally rather than kind of relying on external vendors year after year, right? And our kind of evaluation of this is, well, if you answered yes to 4 of these questions, then you're ready to immediately kind of implement a system, right? And if you answered kind of no or not sure to any of these questions, then like you're in a position to work with an organization like ours to help you become audit ready and implement the system simultaneously, because we'll train your team as kind of we go ahead. And now I'll kind of like, pause and kind of maybe open it up to some questions. I know we have a question in the chat, and Muhammad asks, and I'm going to ask Chechep, I'm going to ask you to answer this question. But it's like when new data needs to be generated or adapted, such as extrapolation or scaling, how do clients typically handle that process? And how is data maintained in an audit-ready format to ensure traceability and compliance?
Yeah, I guess like I had a lot of encounter with kind of like data extrapolations. Even in Zero, some of the Zero client requires data extrapolations. So I think there are two key points when generating extrapolated data. The first is on the methodology standpoint, and second is on the data traceability standpoint. On the methodology standpoint, it should be clear how we are kind of like expressing the extrapolated data. We usually do data extrapolation to filling in the gap of missing data. And one of the most common methodology is by building some kind of like a mirror. So like for all of the missing data that we have, all of the data gap that we have within the data sets, we see the data that is available. So let's say we're missing like 5% of the data, but we have like the remaining 95% of the data. So the 5% is usually need to be reflecting like the remaining 95% of the data. So this kind of methodology, how you come to the process of filling in the gap of data is really important. And different emission category has different methods of data extrapolations. You can build like a straightforward kind of like calculus to filling in the data, or maybe you should kind of like adding more variable into your data extrapolations. Maybe you add like temporal variable, you add more of a spatial variable to make it more kind of like real time as well as the location specific. That's really important to maintain. And then like the second one is basically how you embed like this kind of like data extrapolation traceability into your data. So what we do in Zero is basically we have the data, the output of data extrapolations, and then behind of this data output, you will be able to trace where all of this data sources coming from. Oh, it's coming from the remaining 95% of available data plus some of additional variable, and then like this is the methodology that applies to generate like this data that is not a real data but extrapolated data to filling in the gap that we have to complete the emissions inventory. So I guess like those are the two important things on how to maintain audit ready for extrapolated data. First on methodology, second is like to show the documentation behind each of the data points that you are generating.
So I think we have a second question here, right? Thanks, Chechup, for your super detailed explanation. I think I'm just going to add to that extrapolation question, yeah, which is if you don't have a system, you don't track any of this, yeah. So let's say Nejd was the person that did all the work, and then she leaves the organization. Someone's digging through her emails and digging through her scribbled notes or her Excel files that were downloaded by IT to understand how she actually did everything to calculate those emissions. And I think the fundamental step is having a system and making sure that system can handle that extrapolation or scaling is one important, yeah. And as you can hear from Chechup, we're covering that kind of problem. But two, like if you don't have a system, you have no record. Yeah, and as people leave an organization or join an organization and you have to revisit what you did in the past, this becomes a massive problem. Yeah, it's like someone took the abacus and shook it and then it wasn't lined up anymore, and then you pretended you knew what happened. Chechup, I'll let you answer the second question too, right? So I think Faris has asked, how does Zero respond to a change of management structure or an entity boundary change because a company makes investments or divests from its organization? I think there's an element of like data lineage here, closing the books, but then also adjusting the boundaries. But I'll let you kind of answer.
Yeah, so I guess for this one, it really depends on like what kind of company that we are talking about. Are we talking about like just normal operational company, so to say, or are we talking about investment firm? Because it's really different depending on the type of the company we're talking about. Let's say we're talking about the normal operational company like a holding. They have certain business and then they acquire another business. So I think we just had like this kind of case as well. And then like the best approach to do this, there's actually like two approach. First is that acceptable approach. The first one is that you have to restate your holding emissions boundary if it's emissions baseline, if it's already fixed and you have like certain target that you verified with SBTI or something like that, then you will need to kind of like restate your emissions baseline. You have to, it's not like you have to redo the entire organizations, but you have to also kind of like incorporate the new organization's emission data into the new holding kind of like emissions baseline. If it's generally, if it's like there's like a different methodology applies to the holding and the new organizations, it's always acceptable because the two organizations always run on a separate kind of like vessels previously. So it's okay if they have like different kind of methodology, but moving forward, we need to kind of like manage the transition. So like in the coming years, the emissions record, emission inventory process can be happen with a single kind of like methodology or approach. And usually it's if both company have like a good emission practice before the acquisition or before the merger, there wouldn't be much needs of like additional disclosure note or like restating that you just acquire a company or such, because generally like there wouldn't be much of a major change in terms of the emissions output. That's for the normal holding company. But then if you're an investment firm, generally you would take what you have at the end of your book. So for example, you only holds the company for the duration of like 5 months between the May until October, for example, so that you don't have to like count the emission for this company that just come and go within the single year. But for example, by the December 2025, you have like you just acquire, for example, a large organization as your new investment portfolio, then you also need to count like this company's emission proportional to how much stake that you own within this company. So there's like a different guidelines for it as well. You refer to GHG protocol technical, the normal technical guidelines for if you're just running a normal holding operational company. But if you are like a financial institution, if you're in investment vessels, so you refer to PCAF because they have like different kind of like methods of like consolidating data for investment company who are acquiring, dissolving companies throughout the year, or like investing in certain companies and like have the book closed at certain month.
I think, and let me, I probably could have like directed this question at Nedged, but like, let's Nedged, I'm going to give an example of what just because I've been thinking about what the question was and what Chechuk was saying. So Nedged has a customer, publicly listed company. We've been measuring their emissions for 3 years, 2022, 2023, 2024, SBTI verified, audited emissions from 2022 onwards within this organization. They purchased another business. Yeah. Now we work with this organization. This organization has a consultant involved that's been involved in their sustainability journey, uses our system to upload their data every year. The primary organization that's publicly listed, the boundaries are mapped in the system. Different people across the organization upload data on a monthly basis, where that information is pulled via API into our system, and emissions are clear at the end of every month for all the subcategories being measured monthly, and clear at the end of the year for everything scope 1 to 3, 14 subcategories of scope 3, right? Now, they bought another company, and they're like, we've got a re-baseline based on 2022 with the new company. So what happened? The consultants added the entities, went into our software, added the entities that needed to be added as part of the new organization, right? So under the holding, we have 3 more companies that were added. Then they set a baseline date to trigger tasks to collect data for all the subcategories from 2022, 2023, and 2024 for the old entity. the consultant then goes and works with that organization to, instead of us doing this, because we're working through a consulting partner here, that consulting partner does the steps of like data mapping and sourcing with that new organization. But they take that information, they liaise with that organization, and they immediately start uploading the data into Zeroe, right? And are able to generate a report of the new holding and the baseline organization that has, you know, the original company plus the company that's been acquired for 2022, 2023, and 2024. And the system keeps record of the original entity and the new entity and the rebaseline numbers. And obviously, as Cecep explained, you know, we advise on kind of keeping the methodology consistent and the emissions factors consistent so that there is kind of data lineage and you don't have to restate all your disclosures. But this is like almost like a self-service tool, right? So this Nejd is involved in advising on the changes of how to use the system. But in this case, the organization and their consultant actually just go into our system and make those changes and are able to kind of keep that lineage because of the way the system is set up to do so. I'm going to ask if there are any more questions. And if not, then we'll probably wrap it up. Any more questions? No? Cool. What we'll do after this call, we're going to send out through kind of like our a little bit of an audit ready in action emissions brief, which will be a document that kind of summarizes kind of what we discussed on this call and kind of the approach to things. If you're an organization that we already work with, thanks for coming. I see a couple of them up here. And if you're an organization that's kind of interested in how we can help your organization kind of go on this journey in an efficient manner, we'd love to get in touch and please reach out to us. We'll send a recording of this call also to everyone, or this webinar, so to everyone after the call, so you can kind of watch it at your leisure. We're generally kind of like, you know, why do we do what we're doing at Zeroe? We genuinely believe that doing this manually is not productive for an organization and not what is needed for organizations to achieve sustainability targets. We believe that kind of providing software and not supporting organizations to implement that software and generate audit-ready numbers as part of that implementation process is essentially like giving you a kitchen and not teaching you how to cook in the kitchen. So a key differentiator in terms of like how we look at approaching things is providing software that your organization will be able to use to generate audit-ready data from day one. But providing you with a piece of software that allows your organization to own the process and repeat it yourself without us. Yeah, and we have customers that are on kind of year 3 of their measurement journey that are uploading their data themselves, generating their audit-ready reports, and confident in their data that we're not kind of doing it for them. They're not relying on consultants, and that provides that organization with tangible information that can decarbonize. It empowers the sustainability teams within those organizations to work across the company, right? Rather than being kind of the bee in everyone's ear saying, can you pass me that data? It's late. I need that data. I need to produce a report 6 months after the financials, which is not generally value-adding for anyone. I see we have one more question. No, that's it. Great. Cool. Thank you very much and have a good day. Bye-bye.